So as we describe these kinds of exercises of pastoral listening, particularly as Dittes is laying out for us, we've talked a little bit about the overview of what that might look like theologically, what kind of emotional space we're trying to provide. But in this place, we're thinking also about some particular techniques that we can use when having this kind of conversation. There's a couple of things that Dittes wants to remind, and that is we are renunciating something for a little while when having this kind of conversation of deep listening. There are 4 things in which Dittes says that we really need to let go of just for a little while for this particular instance. This is not to say that these are things that we must relinquish at all times, and there are certainly appropriate times in which we must hold on. But just for this kind of exercise, it may last no more than half an hour to an hour of your time. These are the kinds of things that we need to think about. First off, we may have to suspend the general rules of etiquette. We may have to take a hiatus on that, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that might convey. We also have to think about ways in which we can relinquish our sense of competence, our sense of proficiency, our sense of performance. Instead of thinking of the world looking at us to assure that we are being good pastors, we may have to reconsider and even suspend our sense of being helpful. We have to relinquish a sense sometimes of our pastoral identity. And not only do we have to sometimes suspend our notions of being helpful, but other people's as well. That we might be doing things in these kinds of conversations that, should someone be looking at us, they might think, I'm not really sure that this conveys the pastoral. This doesn't sound pastoral. This isn't the expectation that's been placed upon the church by culture or by tradition, and it looks maybe even a little bit unorthodox. And so this is actually a very big task to ask us to sometimes give up very big pieces of us that are quite important, even for small spaces of time. We also have to think about ways in which we can sometimes renunciate the relationships we have with other people. This is to say, and again, bringing back the concept of the pastoral stance, that we are in a place of deep love for our people, for the people that surround us at all times. But sometimes we have to give up the pursuit of that love. We have to give up the pursuit of relationship with people that we so desperately would like to seek, so that we actually give the space that would allow for this kind of listening. And so when I spoke of etiquette earlier, there are kinds of things that we've been told not to do in order to provide for quote-unquote good manners. And these are the kinds of things in this sort of conversation that may just have to be given up. The first thing that we may have to consider is when we're thinking not to let any silence happen. Silence may be okay. It may be uncomfortable, unnatural to let that happen because we have a sense that we're not being useful, that we're not providing the kind of care that's needed. But sometimes conversations must lapse into silence. We're also told that little white lies are helpful, and that we are to make things as pleasant as possible. But this is the kind of thing that we may want to forget about, just for a little while, because sometimes these can cover up, and sometimes this prevents us from getting to the truth of where people are. We also have to think about ways in which we love to reassure distress. When we hear of something difficult, we want to offer affirmation, and it's right and good that that be our desire. However, sometimes that isn't helpful. In this kind of situation, if someone comes up with a problem, big or small, it may be useful for us not to attempt to reassure. Not to say, oh, but I know that you'll go through, I know that you'll do well, I know that it will be okay in the end. Because what that can do is to take away the present moment and take away the present experience that they might be having. And certainly, even in times of what might seem trivial to us, say someone is tired of moving and they say, well, I would just like to stop moving. I would like to settle in somewhere. Rather than saying, well, I'm sure that you can make friends very easily, and in no time you'll feel right at home, so don't worry so much. that takes away from the experience of where they are now, just as an example. And this is something, this present moment, that we're really trying to get a hold of in this kind of exercise. And sometimes when we have conversations, when we want especially to move towards helpfulness, we want to show involvement. This is, after all, good etiquette. We hear of a funeral, we hear of a death, and we want to show our involvement. We want to be involved. We want to let them know. Let me know how I can help in any way possible. Let me offer advice when I too had to go through the same thing, when I had my diagnosis. Let me tell you about what I was able to do that might be helpful to you. There's nothing wrong with these kinds of responses, and again, they can be very pastoral in nature. But for this kind of exercise, we really want to move away from offering advice, from offering help, and allowing for the space between ourselves and the other person to be. We also have to be careful about gathering facts and asking questions. When we have a desire to help, sometimes we might ask and inquire a lot of things, or we might really be looking towards questions and figuring out events and how things have happened and when they happened, because we think this can be useful. But what this can actually happen, what this can do, is to preempt the discomfort of expressing feelings. And it may be a way of deterring us from talking about feelings, instead of allowing for a space to happen where that is more possible. We also have to be careful about rationalizations and explaining. And sometimes we want to say that we know the reason for something. We want to live in a rational universe. But the ambiguities and the difficulties and the mysteries of life need to be honored, especially as we have this kind of listening. So we can't say, well, the cause of the plane crash was, this is what I thought it would be. We have to allow ourselves to keep some distance and not to try to explain away feelings or events, but allow for that mystery to be. Another thing we really have to look out for is to moralize. And Dittes says this is a kind of form of explanation, and when we pronounce the difference between right and wrong, this is, after all, what people expect of pastors, right? But these can be ways, again, of suppressing feelings. The right feeling, the wrong feeling. If people feel that their emotions are incorrect, they will be very reluctant to proclaim them and to own them. This will get in the way of their healing and will get in the way of what they need in order to encounter the grace of God. And so for this purpose, what we would like to do is to suspend these kinds of etiquette conventions, to suspend our questions, to suspend our judgments, to suspend our desire to reassure or to offer help, but instead literally to stand there as a vessel, in a way, as a vehicle to try to see where the other person is coming from. This is a place of empathy. We're really trying to understand what it is like to be them. This is not something that we can proclaim to be an expert on, and therefore we need all of the information from them to tell us what it is to be them and what it is to experience what they feel. This, as noted, is not something that we can do on a regular basis. This is not the kind of listening that is easily figured out. It is not natural and a skill to be acquired. But the hope is that when we have conversations with our congregants, with the people that we encounter, that sometimes we will allow for a space where they can simply have a chance to explore their own feelings and essentially to come to their own conclusions and to encounter God in their own, so that we're more of a coach. We're a presence, we're a witness, and we no longer see ourselves as front and center.